Okay, we just take a couple of minutes to kind of arrive, bring the attention from wherever it was to the felt somatic sensations of the body, here and now in this posture. Feet on the floor, sitting bones on the seat, spine erect but not military ramrod erect. See if we can pick up the sensations of the breath in the body. Brighten the awareness of those sensations on the in-breath. Relax more profoundly into the posture on the out-breath. Letting go of anything we may be holding on to. Breathing out any tensions or obscurations. Just resting there, letting the mind and body settle in their natural state for a few moments. Okay, thank you. So, good to see you. For those of you who don't know me, although I can recognise quite a lot of faces, my name's Roy Sutherwood, and I look after the Tibetan Buddhist class here on a Tuesday, and a student of Geshe Tashe's over at Jamyang Buddhist Centre, where until yesterday I was director, but I stepped down as director, and Marcos Troyer has taken over, and well, I've not quite stepped down because although there's been a month's handover, it looks like we might need a bit more. So, and of course, I'll still be teaching there, and very much a part of the community. Might also be able to do a little bit more for the Buddhist Society, so that'll be good too. So we came here tonight to listen to the Kalachakra, and it was really an idea that Odin had when. Did anybody come to see Khenpo Rinpoche, great Janangpa master of the Kalachakra? And we kind of thought, well, there were quite a lot of people that were saying, what's this all about? And there wasn't a lot of time. So we thought it might be a good idea to have a talk on the Kalachakra. So that's what I'm going to try and do, but I'll make no apologies for the fact that I'm going to do what it says on the can. It's an extremely complex and comprehensive tantra, if not, the most complex and comprehensive in the Buddhist tradition. So I'm not going to attempt in the time or just straight off to do some great scholarly piece on it. What I'll be looking to do is to talk very, very basically about how tantra relates to basic Buddhism, if you like, because that's really, really very important. So say a little bit about that, say a little bit about Tantra, and then look at the history and the overview of the Kalachakra Tantra in a really basic way, in the hope that you can get a really clear idea of it rather than be bedazzled with tons and tons and tons of scholarly detail. But that's not to say if that works and the Buddhist Society like it, I could always come back and do talks on various aspects, and then once that preparatory work's been done, there's a better chance of people understanding it, as it were. So I suppose the first thing to think about is why Tantra at all? What's Tantra all about? What's going on there then, as it were? And I'm often sort of always saying that you can pretty much take all Buddhism, wherever you find it, right back to a really profound understanding of the Four Noble Truths, bearing in mind that the fourth Noble Truth is the Noble Eightfold Path. So if you really understand that rationale, then it's possible to understand, have an appreciation of how Tantra emerged, and also why would Tantra be effective or make your understanding and progress on the path in terms of the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold path any better than it would be without Tantra, as it were. So you get a good understanding of that. And I think it's people do, of course, because there are, now the main custodians of the Vajrayana or Tantric Buddhism are the Tibetan people. It emerged in northern India, but in the 7th century went into China, went a little bit from China into Japan. There is still Shingon and Tendai Buddhism in Japan, which is esoteric and tantric in nature. And there is indigenous Chinese forms, which are now mainly to be found in Taiwan or completely out in the mountains and the wilds. But you'd have to say now that the real classic locus of Buddhist Tantra and the custodians of that tradition are the Tibetan people. And it's sort of entered Tibet from India, although famously under the kind of the story talks about Padmasambhava, the lotus-born, a very famous figure, but of course he wasn't the only one, but stands as probably one of the giants of Indian Tantricism going into Tibet and assisting with the first wave of translations from Sanskrit into Tibetan. And now, so complete in that sense is the Tibetan canon where Tantra is concerned that, of course, many Sanskrit texts have got lost. So scholars, with the help of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and many others, are able to re-engineer the Sanskrit from the Tibetan, if you can find a copy in Tibetan, but the Sanskrit's been lost. Yeah? And then in some cases, at a later date, the Sanskrit turns up and you're really able to match them, because these, archaeology being what it is, texts are still being found and discovered in that way. So if we go back first to the Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering, the truth of the origin of suffering, the possibility of the cessation of suffering, and the Noble Eightfold path to the cessation of suffering. And if you'll remember, we're thinking here not just of gross, worldly, mental and physical suffering. There's also the suffering of change, which is a form of suffering that kind of is universal and ceaseless, because everything is impermanent, because nothing lasts. And very often the things that we want very quickly become the things that we don't want, or something that we like becomes something that we don't like. And right back in the Four Noble Truths there was the Buddha saying, have a look. It's sort of not getting enough of what you do want and getting too much of what you don't want. That's my paraphrase. Is a cause of suffering. And the suffering of change is a fairly obvious one. Where we, like just now, I came out and it was cold, and I thought that's good. I put the gillet on, but when I come down to sit here, I'm thinking, it might be too warm. So something I did for good effect, I may regret now, but I don't know. But that's a very trivial example. But so there's a suffering of change, and then there's another level of suffering called pervasive suffering, which I suppose from a Buddhist point of view is the most important one. Pervasive suffering is the awareness that it's not just that the building and the table and me and you are getting older moment by moment. It's not that it happens over a year. It's that things are disintegrating moment by moment as we speak, at every level, right down to and including the molecular level. There's nothing really stable or unchanging there. And it's a one-way journey from the cradle to the grave. Knowledge of birth is the knowledge of death. if you wanted to be cheeky with the semantics, you could say that what's the biggest cause of death on the back of the planet? Birth, of course. That's kind of how it goes. And that relates very much to the Four Noble Truths and indeed the life story of the Buddha. You know, what did he see when he went out with his charioteer? He came across a sick person, an old person, a corpse, and a yogi. And when he set out on his journey of renunciation, he was looking to really understand what that was all about. And then, as a result of his enlightenment, he encapsulated the enlightenment in the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. There's also the three signs of being, but they're embedded in there, you know, in the sense of impermanence, dukkha itself, which is this pervasive dissatisfaction, which we'll talk a little bit more about, and anatta, or no self, which in the Mahayana becomes the emptiness of all phenomena, shunyata in Sanskrit, including oneself. So that pervasive suffering is, I suppose the best way I could describe it, is quite a deep existential angst, you know, the recognition of the human condition on the back of the planet. I deliberately reach for existential angst because some of the things that the contemporary existentialist writers have had to say about it, especially and insofar as they don't tip over too much into a form of postmodernist nihilism, as it were, is very pertinent and very relevant to a Buddhist understanding in terms of what the Buddha taught about pervasive suffering. And he also had something very special to say about its origin and the possibility of its cessation, in which he was saying that this pervasive suffering that arises as a result of the human condition is, how can we say, it arises because we actively misperceive what we perceive. Yeah, we accept things as they appear and think that they exist in that way, when in actual fact they may not. Yeah. So if we are chasing after what we like and trying to avoid what we don't like, based on a misperception of the way things actually are, then it's even easier to see how that's going to lead further to quite deep suffering. Yeah? So that the root cause of the suffering is a form of ignorance, but it's not an ignorance in the usual sense of the word. It's an ignorance in terms of sort of actively assenting to things existing in the way that they appear, rather than the way that they actually are. And that if that ignorance can be cut at the root, then the cessation of suffering is possible, and the Noble Eightfold Path is set out as a way to go there. And if you remember, the Noble Eightfold Path is kind of divided into three divisions, because what it's setting up is a path for a way of life that will sustain the arising of wisdom through concentration and meditation. Yeah? And that concentration, single-pointed attention, is often summed up in the term shamatha, and the wisdom is sort of summed up in Buddhist practice as insight, or vipassana in Sanskrit, meditation. So it's all leading there for the arising of wisdom. The arising of wisdom would be to have a direct perception of the way things actually are, and not to be having to do something about that, but it to be a fundamental part of one's being, to live out of there. That would be the difference between being ignorant and being enlightened. That would be the difference between being trapped in cyclic existence and suffering in samsara, or being liberated from that cyclic existence and fully enlightened. So then on the basis of that emerges the Mahayana, what's known as the Great Vehicle. And I suppose if you wanted to characterize, there are many ways of presenting it, but if you wanted to simply characterize really what defines Great Vehicle or Mahayana Buddhism, it's the universal character and scope of its altruism. Because if all over the world Buddhists identify themselves very often by reciting before their practice, often and repeatedly, daily, what are known as the Refuge Lines, or the lines of safe direction, where refuge or safe direction is taken from the three jewels of the Buddha as the founder, Gautama Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha, the Dharma, the teaching, what he taught, and what all Buddhas before him and after him will teach as the real source of refuge and safe direction, as a way to gain liberation from samsara and full enlightenment. And then the Sangha, all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the past, the present and the future, all ordained monks and nuns, all yogis and yoginis, all meditational deities, all sentient beings, and in its most contemporary sense, of course, anyone and everyone who is looking to follow the Noble Eightfold Path and would be more likely to be our spiritual friend than hinder us on the path. So there's that very, in the arising of the Mahayana, there's this very strong universal altruism which says, if I really, because if you just slide across back to the Four Noble Truths, in the turning of the wheel of the Dharma Sutra, the Dharma Chakra Sutra, which is really the basic sutra of the Buddha's enlightenment, is what he taught in the deer park at Sarnath to his 5 disciples after he'd achieved enlightenment. He not only says these are the Four Noble Truths, he actually says in each case what it's profitable for us to do with them. So where dukkha or suffering is concerned, it was profitable to understand it. And by understand it, if you look at, what does the understanding mean there? He didn't mean just intellectually understand it. He meant to really plumb the depths of it and know what it is, because it's only if that was the case, if instead of being distracted here, there and everywhere, or in denial about it, or running away from it, or lost somewhere else, if we really were present with that particular suffering and that pervasive suffering, there is the motivation for doing something about it, for rooting out the very basis of that ignorance and following the Noble Eightfold Path to it. Without that, it might just be an intellectual idea. But if there's a fundamental change of heart and mind at that level, then there's the possibility that you might form the intention that will actually, and an aspiration that will actually carry you to the possibility of doing it, or being it, as it were. So the Mahayana is saying, if we could indeed understand our suffering in that way, it would be unbearable. It would be unbearable for a moment. We would need no persuading that we need to do something about it. And if it was unbearable in that way, if we really did understand it, you would also understand that this is a suffering common to all sentient life. So how much less unbearable would the suffering of all other sentient life be? Which leads to the yearning or the intention of saying, I don't just want to gain enlightenment for myself alone, but for the benefit of all sentient beings. And in the Bodhisattva ideal, that goes as far as saying, not only do I wish to gain enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, but I wish to take responsibility for making it possible for them to empty samsara, to bring about the cessation of suffering in all sentient life, which is very much a part of the Bodhisattva ideal. Now, it's said in the sutras, which is why this is often called the Sutrayana, the sutras being the texts which are largely the Buddha's word, and the Shastras, the comments upon them by scholar yogis, as it were. And these particular sutras, the root sutras for the Mahayana, is the Prajnaparamita literature, the perfection of wisdom literature. There are subsequently others, but that's really the root source of the rise of the Mahayana. So in those sutras, it says that so arduous is the progress towards enlightenment, really understanding the nature of your suffering, and how against a really, cosmic scale of beginningless and endless lives, cyclic existence at that level, let alone the cyclic existence that occurs almost momentarily or hour by hour in this one for us psychologically now. There's a kind of a macrocosmic as well as a microcosmic perspective on this, that it would take, and there are many, many different numbers, most of them big in Buddhism, that are saying it's going to take you an incalculable amount of time to achieve enlightenment, but you must, that's where you go. So then, at a certain point, there is the emergence in India, in both what we would now call Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism, but I think in particular, most famously in Hinduism with Kashmiri Shaivism, the emergence of Tantra. So what was Tantra? Well, we'll think about the meaning of the word in a minute, but basically, in a nutshell, it's the idea that you could possibly accelerate the attainment or realization of liberation and full enlightenment by the use of yogic methods, largely meditations of a yogic nature, which would accelerate the path to enlightenment. Yeah? So from a bodhisattva's point of view, if it was going to take you an incalculable length of time to bring about your own liberation, let alone assist others, and there was the possibility of using what's been contemporarily called a spiritual technology involving yogic means to effect that path, to accelerate it and do it quicker, would you want to or not? Well, if you were really committed to gaining enlightenment, not just for yourself, but for all sentient beings, then Tantra may be a very attractive proposition. Yeah? So this is really simplifying it, but it gives you a simple, clear idea of why Tantra is thought to be efficacious, and why would you do this rather than just carry on with the Sutrayana path. And nor does the adoption of the Vajrayana or Tantrayana mean some sort of dismissal of the Sutrayana. The one grows out of the other and sustains the other. Yeah? For entry into Tantra, Bodhisattva vows should have been taken. Yeah? It's usually a prerequisite for any tantric empowerment or initiation. There should be a reasonable understanding and experience of some sort of shamatha, some sort of training of the attention to calm the mind and to be able to deepen and sustain the concentration so that you can focus single-pointedly on a particular object. And in the Sutrayana, the ultimate object is the emptiness of one's self and others and everything else. And the more subtle the mind that you can use to do this, so you have a very subtle consciousness in meditative equipoise upon emptiness. That's what brings about liberation and full enlightenment. Yeah. So to have the aspiration to be aware of what's called bodhicitta, or the awakened mind, and to take a vow to achieve it, not just oneself, but for the sake of all sentient beings, is quite an important preparatory vow in most Tantra paths, yeah? And also to have some ability to bring the mind into a calm state and single-pointedly focus on something. Because one of the things that's going to happen here in Tantra is you're talking about getting what's referred to as the clear light mind, yes? A mind of great unchanging bliss, a very fundamental and blissful innermost awareness, engaged in meditative equipoise upon emptiness, or the emptiness of all things itself. And it's that generates the realization of enlightenment, descent of wisdom, call it what you will. So that's how Tantra's working, but it's going to use kind of yogic means to do that. There are lots of different presentations of Tantra. Not lots, but 3 or 4 different ways of categorizing it, because Tantra itself in Sanskrit means continuum, and it also refers to a certain type of text. So scholars classify texts as sutra or tantra by the content of the texts. Yeah? And then, of course, over a period of time in Buddhist Tantra, from the 1st or the 2nd century, right up to the 10th and 11th century, you've got a lot going on in terms of Tantra, tantric texts, developments, teachers, and so on and so forth. So to have what scholars would call a little bit of doxography here, some sort of framework for understanding it, getting it, being able to see where things fit, is not a bad idea. I'm going to keep it simple. It can get very, very complex, but again, I'll keep it as simple as I can so that it's clear. But also appreciate it is just a scholar's model, just a way of categorizing stuff so you can get a handle on it, yeah? So one of these, and this one, I'm borrowing from if you look at Tibetan Buddhism, having Nyingmapa, which is the oldest, it literally means the ancient ones or the old ones, the Shakya, the Kagyu, which itself has 12 sub-schools, yeah, and the Gelug, and then before that there is the indigenous Bonpo. There is the Jonang and some other subsects, but there's those 4 or 5 main schools or categories of Tibetan Buddhism. Everybody would agree without any doubt that Tantra's defined what are these yogic means that accelerate the path to enlightenment, or hold the possibility of you accelerating the path to enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. What defines, though, that yoga is deity yoga. It's the use of meditational deities and mandalas, which are perfect environments, often referred to as mandala palaces. Yeah? So it's the use of these in meditation and working with the subtle body. Yeah? There's a kind of a subtle physiology involved here, which is, if you're reaching for an idea to understand it, you're not a million miles away from the chakra systems of Indian yoga and Kashmiri Shaivism and so on and so forth. That involves working with meditational deities that represent, yeah, or represent symbolize aspects of the enlightened mind. Yeah, aspects of the enlightened mind. And there's from the perspective of this particular presentation, right across that time from the 1st to 2nd century to 10th or 11th, there's 4 kind of classes of Tantra: Kriya, Karya, Yoga, and unexcelled Yoga Tantra. Highest Yoga Tantra is good enough for short. And in the first one, you're very much concerned with external disciplines. You know, its retreats and its practices are very much concerned with the externals, the washing of the body, bodily discipline, diet, all manner of things. And then in the next one, slightly less, and starting to think more about the inner in Karya. And in Yoga Tantra, you're much more thinking about the inner dimension rather than the external dimension. And in Highest Yoga Tantra, it's wholly coming from that inmost awareness perspective, although that's not to say it doesn't have rituals or isn't concerned to a degree with external discipline, but the emphasis is on the inner. Also keeping it simple, because there are other things I'm leaving out lots here to get it off the ground, as it were. In the Kriya, Karya and Yoga Tantra practices, you are working with a meditational deity that's being visualized in front of you or on the top of your head. Yeah. And you may not need an empowerment to work in that way. Yeah. Abhisheka in Sanskrit, or Wang in Tibetan. Sandra could pronounce the word better than me. And in Highest Yoga Tantra, you are dissolving yourself into emptiness and then arising as the deity. Yeah? That's the difference between Highest Yoga Tantra and the Kriya, Karya or Yoga Tantras, the principal difference. There's many others, but that'll give you a very kind of clear thing to look at if you're unfamiliar with Tantra. And then in Highest Yoga Tantras, over time, there are different main meditational deities and their mandalas. Yeah. The earlier one of there are probably some smaller ones, but one of the earliest big ones for Buddhism, 1st, 2nd century, is called the Gya Samaja, or the Secret Assembly. Yeah. And there are others: Yamantaka, Chakra Samvara, Evajra, Ayagriva. There are quite a few of the big meditational deities and their mandalas there. And the last one is 10th to 11th century, is the Kalachakra, or Wheel of Time Tantra. And this is the deity, meditational deity, Kalachakra, the Wheel of Time. Yeah? And this one sort of went from India to Tibet around or it kind of emerged in India around the middle of the 10th century. And it was in Tibet probably about sort of 60 years later, around 1027. So it's the last of the Buddhist Tantras. It's the largest in the sense that the mandala palaces have deities in the palace as well as the main deities. Yeah. And in the largest version, because there are 2 or 3 of the Kalachakra Tantra, there are 722 deities living in the mandala. It also contains, because of all that history, it's fair to say it's a very syncretic, yeah, and a lot of syncretic and synthesizing activity going on So it contains an enormous amount about Buddhist astronomy stroke astrology, because there was no difference between the two subjects at the time, mathematics, medicine, rhetoric. In fact, the kind of summation of all the Buddhist arts and sciences are contained in, summarized, and have a place in the Kalachakra Tantra. It's also a very visionary Tantra, and it's one both in terms of its past and the way it looked at the future, and it's also an extremely kind of complex and comprehensive Tantra, and it's synthesizing many different elements, some of which are coming from non-Buddhist origins, from Hindu, Shaivite, Jain, without, it's not looking, there's nothing hidden here. It's doing this deliberately at a particular time, when if you think back to the 10th century in northern India, it was being overrun and destroyed from many quarters. So the great wheel of time, it was no doubt the hope of those who were teaching it and practicing it, would be like a huge seed bearer to carry the Dharma forward through that kind of almost apocalyptic destruction and preserve it for future generations, so that the means to accelerating the path to enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings wouldn't be lost. So all of that makes it quite a fascinating Tantra, but it's also wherein its kind of complexity and richness lies. If anybody's really interested in it, I could only say what little I've been able to do in terms of studying it has always richly rewarded me. It's also tantras were tantric empowerments and initiations were traditionally given to very small groups of people by teachers, whereas the Kalachakra has always been given, the empowerments and the blessings of the Kalachakra Tantra have always been given to very large groups. And the line of the Dalai Lamas has been instrumental in this, and the current Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama, has given and continues to give many Kalachakra initiations, which are attended by hundreds of thousands of people. Also, because of Western interest in the actual practice, in both the generation and perfection processes of the Tantra, there's a much bigger kind of pull to understand that better. So there are more and more Tibetan teachers, highly qualified, highly competent masters of their lineages, that are now prepared to follow up on these empowerments by helping rightly motivated students take up the practice and the study. Yeah? The Tantra itself goes back to a set of texts based around the Kalachakra. The root Tantra, the full root Tantra, has never been found. But there is a document called the Lagu Tantra, yeah? And it's said to be an abridged form of an original text, which is the Kalachakra Mula Tantra, the root Tantra of the Kalachakra. And one of the best accounts of this that we have is by a really immense, great Tibetan historian and practitioner called Taranatha. And he says that the Mula Tantra was taught by the Buddha on the full moon of the month Kaitra in the year following his enlightenment at the great stupa of Dhyana-Katika. And that great stupa of Dhyana-Katika is in southern India, in a place called Amaravati. Yeah? And unfortunately, sort of cultural imperialism being what it is, you can probably see more of it in the British Museum than you can in Amaravati. But there is still quite a lot in Amaravati, and they've also done a lot to preserve it. His Holiness, I think 2006, gave Kalachakra initiation there, and as a result of that, and inspired by that, and triggered by that, you know, money and governments and everybody got talking together. So they're very much trying to keep what they have in Amaravati, what relics of the old stupa, and also broaden and widen what they might do to recognise its significance from the point of view of the Kalachakra Tantra. And it's a very mythological story, because it's a story of the Buddha appearing in two places at once. It's said that while he was teaching the Prajna Paramita Sutras on massive vulture mountain in Rajagriha, he simultaneously appeared as Kalachakra inside the great stupa at Dhyana Katika at the request of a king of Shambhala, itself a domain or a realm that you'll have a job if you start looking for it physically on the back of the planet, as it were. So he responded to the request of King Suchandra from Shambhala to teach the Kalachakra Tantra, and that is where the Mula Tantra was expounded, of which the abridged form, the Laghu Tantra, is all we have that survives. Although very interestingly, some more pieces have been found in the Sanskrit this year. So that's of great interest to Kalachakra scholars and practitioners. So the original explanatory Tantra had 60,000 lines as a commentary on the original Mula Tantra of 12,000, and a later king of Shambhala, Yasas, Manjushri Yasas, wrote the abridged form of the Tantra, the Laghu Tantra, which we know today, and about a quarter of the length of the original Mula Tantra. That kind of still survives, and that's what most people refer to as the Kalachakra Tantra. And then there was another succeeding king of Shambhala. You can look up the mythology and the lineage of the kings of Shambhala. Pundarika, he composed a commentary, and the commentary is known as the Vimala Prabha, or the stainless light commentary on the Kalachakra Tantra. So the Shasta on the Tantra, the commentary on the Tantra, is known as the Vimala Prabha, or the stainless light commentary. And there is a translation of that, a very good translation of that in English, by a man called Gavin Kilty. It's an excellent translation, and also there is a very good translation of parts of it, the sadhana contained in it, from the Tantra itself, and also from the Vimala Prabha, or stainless light, by Vesna Wallace, who's a very eminent Sanskrit scholar. Gavin's working predominantly with the Tibetan. They both work with Tibetan and Sanskrit, but Gavin's the Tibetan scholar and Vesna is more the Sanskrit scholar. So and also there's a lot of very good materials starting to be translated out of the Janangpa tradition. Khentrul Rinpoche was a fine example of that, and that's this one called The Hidden Treasure of the Profound Path. Is the word-by-word commentary on Taranatha's text concerned with, he formulated it into a complete path, and Khentrul Rinpoche is there commenting on Taranatha's text. So, having been preserved in Shambhala for many, many centuries, it sort of appears in India in the 10th century, and then in Tibet around 1027, and the kind of period of translation and adoption, scholars think, went on for a couple of 100 years. And also the Kalachakra, in terms of its astronomy and sciences, plays a really, really big part in the foundations and core of the Tibetan calendar. It's a very interesting subject, all on its own. And I think there were, among the early teachers of the Kalachakra in Tibet, two who were sort of almost extant contemporaries are normally agreed to stand out. One's called Dolpopa Sherab Gyaltsen. He was 1292 to 1361, and really the founder of the Jonangpa tradition. And Bhutan Rinchen, 1290 to 1364. He was much more broadly across the schools. So Kalachakra is practiced by most of the different traditions within Tibetan Buddhism, have lineages of the Kalachakra. But the two foremost are the Gelug, based largely on the teachings of Bhutan and on the founder of the Gelug tradition, Lord Tsongkhapa, who was himself a great Kalachakra scholar and yogi. And the Jonang tradition, based on Dolpopa. And although Tsongkhapa and Dolpopa may have had interesting philosophical differences, they were both very much at one when it comes to the Kalachakra Tantra. Yeah. So if we go back to the idea of Four Noble Truths and suffering, it's good to go back there, because in explaining Tantra and Highest Yoga Tantra in particular, also very good if you're looking at the pinnacle practices within Nyingma or Kagyu or Gelug Kagyu, Tantra, Dzogchen and Mahamudra practices. There's a perspective there that's really, really useful, a kind of a division into the ground, the path, and the fruit or the result. Yeah, it's a kind of a tripartite distinction to set up a presentation for Tantra. And the ground, when you're talking about the ground, if you like, that's the normal state that we as human beings or sentient beings find ourselves in. It's right where we are now. Here we are, our ordinary consciousness, that's the ground, yeah? Yeah, that's how, in this presentation, it's an easy way to look at it. So it's the normal state that beings find themselves in. And Buddhism is saying, well, the essential characteristic of that state is dukkha, is suffering. You know, it's pervaded by suffering. Everything that is born, everything that's produced, everything that's conditioned back to the Four Noble Truths is pervaded by this pervasive suffering or dukkha that we've touched on earlier. And now you're beginning to see where the connection with that really basic Buddhism comes when you're trying to come at or understand Tantra, and how difficult it is to do that without some understanding of basic Buddhism. Yeah. And so the ground covers the kind of Buddhist theories of why that suffering actually exists, how it's maintained, and of course how within that state there exists the potential to sort of overcome the causes of suffering and achieve enlightenment. The ability to cut off that fundamental ignorance, stop being deceived by things or the misapprehension that things exist in the way they appear, and directly perceive the reality or the truth of things as they are, and gain liberation from cyclic existence, ignorance and suffering, and reach full enlightenment. So the path, that's the ground, yeah? So the path is the kind of description of the practices that are to be followed in order to remove the causes of suffering and achieve enlightenment. So the path in the Four Noble Truths is the Eightfold Noble Path, expressed as the Fourth Noble Truth. Yeah, the ground would be most of the first three. Yeah. So this is the state where you are. This is the pervasive suffering. The path is what you're going to do, yeah, or how you're going to try to follow a path to identify and root out the causes of suffering. Yeah. And the result or the fruit, sometimes maybe goal, the objective, enlightenment itself, the goal, the fruit, whatever, is actually the state of enlightenment, that state of cessation, once the causes of suffering have been completely removed. Yeah. And in all Tantra, there is an approach to ground, fruit and path which says that you're going to take the fruit as the path. You're going to take the fruit as the path. Hence, this is really, really maybe oversimplistic for some, but what in fact you're going to do with a meditational deity and the mandala palace, yes, in the what's frequently called the generation or creation process of tantric practice, to cultivate using visualization and imagination this representation of the enlightened mind, of an aspect of the enlightened mind, or the enlightened mind in a certain aspect. So you would dissolve your ordinary self into emptiness in Highest Yoga Tantra, and then practice generating yourself as the deity, which is an embodiment of the enlightened mind. Yeah? And the body here, the deity here, in Highest Yoga Tantra, a feature that you won't find in either Yoga, Kriya or Karya Tantra, is that the deities they're not single figures, they're with, I can think of one exception, there's a Yamantaka as a solitary hero, and a Vajrayogini, but she really comes out of the chakra samvara cycle, are locked in sexual union with the feminine representing the wisdom principle and the male representing the method or compassion side. And wisdom and compassion are inseparable. Yeah, they're undifferentiable. We conceptually isolate them and characterize them. Yeah. So this is an aspect of the enlightened mind, and of course we were talking about the clear light mind being a blissful consciousness, which is in meditative equipoise on emptiness. So there are many ways of generating a blissful mind, but the energy of sexual union is one of the ways of generating that extremely subtle mind of clear light and having a mind of inordinate great bliss going into meditative equipoise on emptiness. So that's a common feature not just of all Highest Yoga Tantra deities, not just the Kalachakra. And the visualization, when the generation process or creation stage is done, not only includes visualizing yourself as the deity, but transforming the whole environment by visualizing yourself in the Kalachakra sense in the wisdom bliss palace of a large mandala palace, which has got the levels of wisdom bliss, gnosis, but then body, speech and mind mandala. Yeah? There's with 722 deities in it, sitting on top of Mount Meru in a universe. So you're not only purifying yourself, you're purifying the environment. Yeah? And that's also kind of important in terms of the Kalachakra Tantra, because it differs from other highest yoga tantras in a number of ways, but probably the most salient feature is that there is an inner Kalachakra Tantra, an outer Kalachakra Tantra, and an alternative Kalachakra Tantra. There are 3 cycles involved, or 3 realms involved in the Kalachakra Tantra. So in the if you go back to the Kalachakra Tantra, it's divided up into 5 chapters, and the first chapter deals with the outer Kalachakra, which is the physical world. Yeah, that's the physical world, the universe, and in particular the calculation system for the Kalachakra calendar. But it's where you'll find all the astronomy and many other things. And very interestingly, back then, the Kalachakra Tantra was arguing against both other Buddhists and Hindu astronomers that it's probably not a bad idea, if you really want to know what's going on up there, is to look at it. Get a gnomon, put it in the ground, measure the shadow, have a look at what's going on in the heavens, what moves, what doesn't, and was indeed arguing for a tropical rather than a sidereal system, because they fully understood what we now call the precession of the equinoxes. So it was remarkably prescient and early in a lot of its astronomical knowledge. So the outer Kalachakra, which is, you can largely read in the first translation of the first chapter of the Kalachakra, it deals with the physical world. It also kind of covers the basic symbolism of the Kalachakra system. So a good friend of mine noted, who is a really good Kalachakra scholar, there's even fascinating descriptions of series of machines there, ranging from catapults to irrigation machines and even merry-go-rounds for use at the spring festival. So it's the Kalachakra Tantra is indeed fascinating. The second chapter deals with the inner Kalachakra, so that covers the kind of inner world of human existence and sort of deals with the processes of gestation, birth, classification functions of within the human body and experience, and also the what's known in Tantra as the Vajrakaya, the diamond body, kaya meaning body, Vajra meaning adamantine, and this one really is the expression of human physical existence in terms of channels, winds and drops. This is what we're referring to as the subtle body here. And there's a particular interest in the Kalachakra Tantra on 4 states: the waking state, dream, deep sleep, and the so-called full state, which mainly refers to the experience of orgasm. So the potentials, called drops in the system, which give rise to these states, are described together with the processes that flow from them. And those first 2 chapters kind of comprise the ground Kalachakra, describing the state of human existence as it is. If that's not too complicated, I'm relating the outer and inner Kalachakra there to the ground of the ground path result or fruition kind of distinction. Then the next 3 of those 5 chapters describe what's referred to variously as the other or the alternative Kalachakra, and they deal with the path and the result. So the 3rd chapter deals with the preparation or the preliminaries for the meditation practices of the system, and also the initiations or empowerments of Kalachakra. And there are 2 main sets of initiations, and they are usually, most often, except in one tradition, the Abhaya Karagupta tradition, done by the generation and creation of a huge sand mandala. They're not done off a tanka or a cloth, although there is one in the Abhaya-Karagupta tradition which does do that. And this one takes a long time to build. If any of you have ever been or read anything about His Holiness's empowerments, Kalachakra empowerments, those preparations would start some 2 weeks before the first day of the empowerment, or before the evening of the first day of the empowerment, because they would involve the making, you see, the making of a sand mandala of that size with 722 deities. It has to be ritually marked out. Ritual pujas and meditations have to be performed. Dances are done, sacred dances are done. So just to witness or follow the preparation of a Kalachakra mandala for the purposes of empowerment is really quite an amazing experience. And usually when His Holiness gives the initiation, those processes are by and large open to you to go and witness and look at, and quite an incredible demonstration of Tibetan sacred culture at every level it is too. Very, very, very kind of fascinating. So the third chapter is dealing with the meditation practices for the initiations, and the students introduce the process by a teacher, and there is a kind of a process that goes from birth, childhood, puberty, being brought to learning to talk and being brought up to maturity as an adult. And that first set of initiations, as I said, requires the use of the sand mandala and is described in the third chapter. The next set of initiations are called the higher empowerments, and they purify the process of life after puberty. Yeah? And for that reason, there's quite a lot of sexual imagery in the empowerments, and they specifically prepare students or practitioners for what's called the perfection process, meditations in Kalachakra, which is known as the 6 yogas, and not to be confused with the 6 yogas of Naropa. It's a different set of 6. These are the Sadanga yogas, which are unique to the perfection process of the Kalachakra tantric practices. All of the Highest Yoga Tantras, in terms of their practices, are divided into 2 sets of processes. There's, well, 3 actually, because you've got nondro or preliminary practices. Then you've got the generation stage practices, or process is better than stage because it is a process. Yeah, the generation process is the business of cultivating the meditation of yourself as the deity and the mandala palace, and then the what's known as the perfection or completion stage process is actually working with the subtle body to do the yogic work necessary to generate the various states of consciousness required for the realization of in the Kalachakra Tantra, what is known as the empty form. Yeah? And then the 4th chapter explains the meditation practices themselves, both the meditation on the mandala and the deity of Kalachakra in the generation process, and the perfection process of the 6 yogas. So those 2 chapters, 3 and 4, describe the path of Kalachakra. So 1 and 2 deal with the ground, 3 and 4 deal with the path, and the 5th chapter kind of describes the state of enlightenment that results from the practice of the path, and thereby covers what you would call the result or the fruit Kalachakra. Yeah, so that's relating internal, external, and alternative or other to ground, path, and fruit. Now that, in a nutshell, at 1944, is a fairly simple but pacey overview of the Kalachakra Tantra. Do you want to have a rest and think about any questions about either Tantra or the Kalachakra. And I just say, I hope it wasn't too ambitious, but I thought if I could just get across the importance of the basic Buddhism, how it relates to basic Buddhism, how Tantra relates to Sutra, then how Tantra breaks up, and how within Highest Yoga Tantra, where does the Kalachakra or Wheel of Time Tantra sit? So hopefully you're not thinking, oh my God, what's he on about? But I've got a grip of some of that, no? And some of you may know a lot more about it than I do, I don't know.
One question, Roy.
Yeah.
So you said that this was a mismatch of Hinduism, Jainism, and
It's not a mishmash. It's syncretic, certainly, and it contains elements. But it's not. It's we can argue about it.
No.
But a mishmash implies a certain thing. You know, I often use that myself when there's this business. Where do you? Let's suppose now you have a situation where, whereas most of us would be educated and inculcated in the religion that we were brought up in, but now in post the global village and contemporary communications, if we seek a spiritual path which is not the one we brought up in, particularly in a place like London, then you have a smorgasbord of the entirety of the spiritual paths and cultures of the world. Yeah. Well, you could intelligently pick your way through that and find a path for you, and it may involve taking something from one place, taking something from another place, or you could make a mishmash and have a New Age soup which wouldn't have much profundity, depth, coherence, tradition, lineage, authenticity, or anything else. So in that sense, the Kalachakra is not a mishmash. It certainly was highly aware of and used elements from Shaivism, Vaishnavism, Jainism, and some others too. So it was bringing in elements that were not exclusively Indian Buddhist, but it was doing so in a very self-conscious and considered way, yeah, for the purpose of unification. I think it's why, or it's part of an answer to the question, what's this connection between Kalachakra and world peace? You know, because it's a lot to do with unification, and it's a lot to do with people who might be at war with one another, understanding each other's position in respect of their religious belief, praxis, and philosophy.
So would it be right? Because this was more, like I said, the 10th century. So this was at a time when the Mogul and
many others.
And were attacking
India,
so
and many others.
All the scriptures were being destroyed and things. So that's
well, the two largest Buddhist universities in northern India were both destroyed during that period.
Yeah, so
many of the monasteries went down too.
So this is when the three combined together
to
create one particular belief system.
Yeah, there's also the legend of Shambhala. In the legend of Shambhala, the kings of Shambhala called a whole group of sages and holy people together with a view to trying to get them to see the bigger picture, as it were. But they left Shambhala not really getting this. And that is also part of the kind of mythological history of the Kalachakra. That's it would take me too long to cash that all out for you. Sure. But that's there also, the story of the kings of Shambhala and the sages, where they were sort of reluctant to give up the more limited view and look for the larger one. So syncretic, yes. Yeah. Synthetic to a degree, yes. But mishmash, I'd argue no.
Maybe it was the wrong word.
Yeah, no. No, but it's a fair question.
If you could explain some of the, I know there's a lot of symbolism in that picture, but could you explain perhaps a little bit of some of the main picture of the man in the centre?
Yeah.
And God.
Well, the couple in union, the blue face, and the blue arms, red arms, and white arms are the body of Kalachakra. He has 24 arms, and the yellow female figure with her back to you, locked in sexual union with him, is Vishvamata. That's the Kalachakra and the consort, or Vishvamata and her consort. And then in each of the 24 arms, there are implements, yes, and on the right and on the left. And some of the sharp weapons are on the wisdom side, and the other weapons or ritual implements are on the method or the compassion side, and each one has a particular significance, and that particular significance will be multi-layered in terms of its position in a ritual, a psychological quality, an aspect of the enlightened mind, or an aspect of the ordinary mind that will be transformed into something else by the process of tantric practice. At the very top, here is Vajradhara. Yeah, Vajradhara is like it's an interesting one in the Kalachakra, because Vajradhara is like a primordial Buddha. You know, usually, for example, from the Dharmakaya, or the truth body, sort of ultimate reality, if you like, out of that comes an enlightened mind. That enlightened mind usually passes something on to a reflex of itself, often in the form of Vajrasattva, and then Vajrasattva teaches the first human bearer of that tantric system. Yeah, where the yogi or the meditator has a vision of Vajrasattva, who brings him a tradition or a current from Vajradhara. In some other schools it might not be Vajradhara but Samantabhadra. Yeah, but it's the same idea is going on. You're looking at the notion of what's called an Adi Buddha, or a primordial Buddha. Yeah, but in the Kalachakra system, Kalachakra himself is Adi, or the Kalachakra couple are Adi Buddha, yeah, or primordial Buddhas. And he is crowned. It's far too small for you to see here, but he is crowned with Vajrasattva. Is one of the deities, or the deity that, if you look into Tantra, there's a lot of work to be done on what's called the 5 Buddha families or clans. Yeah, this is really at the root of a lot of Tantra and its correspondences. In Kalachakra you've got 6 because they include Vajrasattva. Yeah, there's a lotus, and in the lotus there usually is in tantric tankas either a moon disk, which is white, or a sun disk. Yeah, and peaceful deities appear on the moon disk, and wrathful deities appear on the sun disk. In Kalachakra here, there's 4. There's 2 others. There's a blue and a green one, and that's because they symbolize Rahu and Ketu, which are eclipses that have astronomical references. So there are 4 discs on which he's standing on the lotus. In Tantric art too, the lotus is coming out symbolizing purity. The lotus grows in the mud, but this beautiful thing comes out on the top, and then on the calyx, the moon disc, sun disc, or in the Kalachakra terminology, the Rahu, the Ketu, the moon, and the sun disc. These This, I think, here, I need my glasses again. This is Gya Samaja, the secret assembly, which is the first Buddhist Tantra, and that's the main deity of the Gya Samaja Tantra. And this one is Chakra Samvara from the wheel of from the wheel of bliss. And I think this is what the artist was trying to do there is, but then it's more information, I don't want to get lost. Tantras are also classified into father tantras, mother tantras, and non-dual tantras. Yeah, Kalachakra is a huge non-dual tantra, probably the non-dual tantra. The father tantras are dealing with method and compassion, and the mother tantras are predominantly concerned with clear light of wisdom. Because the wisdom, the female principle, wisdom is the female principle in Buddhism. Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
The whole idea of bodhisattvas, I'm not sort of coming to it.
Yeah.
Bodhisattvas and Buddhas, meditating and radiating love and wisdom and compassion and so forth, so let's say the planet Earth.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence or any examples, that this is working? I mean, is there any has anybody thought about, or is there any kind of...
I don't know anybody that's scientifically investigated it, or whether it would be amenable of such investigation.
Scientifically, but psychically, if you like, spiritually, has it, is there any sense that they're not just wasting, having a lovely time doing this, but it's not actually having any effect?
I've no idea.
Okay.
No idea at all. I'm not psychic, that's for sure.
There's no tradition, there's no sort of inquiry. There's because that's something I would want to know.
Wait, I think it's more from the point of view of this is the way in certainly in Buddhist terms, and the way I would approach it is to say, when you look for a spiritual path or a spiritual practice, yes, obviously you're looking to see what occurs in your experience, and indeed the Buddha was paramount about saying, don't accept this on my authority, don't accept it because I say so, don't accept spiritual authority, take it on your own experience in the same way that you would buy or sell gold in the marketplace. And as we know, assayers of gold, they like to know that what they've got is gold, or they don't pursue it anymore. In the same way, if you're following a tantric path, then you would be looking for a teacher, and there are qualities of a teacher as there are qualities of a good student. Yeah. So if the teacher has all the right qualities, holds the lineage, and has the requisite authenticity, then you begin to think that makes them a reliable teacher. So, for example, to get where I'm going to go to, but it's only a small part, do we really think His Holiness would be continuing to give Kalachakra initiations and doing the practice if he didn't think it was doing any good? Would you rely on him as a trustworthy man in that way? It's for each of us to decide. Yeah.
I was just curious to know if there was any example. If there was. I mean, some people might say, well, actually we can't prove it, but it would be an awful lot worse if they weren't doing it.
Yeah, these are kind of metaphysical questions, which is what I was suggesting, that are not going to be amenable of proof or disproof, It's where you would go or how you would start measuring it, I wouldn't have a clue, really.
Somebody like the Dalai
But you can certainly see that if the one thing I can see is that in getting together with groups of people who've seriously sought to follow and practice a tantric path, whether that be in monastic institutions or ordinary life, it's quite remarkable what a group of people in search of the realization of their full potential and the transformation of their negative emotions can do. And of course they have an impact on other people that they meet. And they have it in the same way that, you know, inspirational figures from all traditions, you know, do this. I mean, how could we prove it one way or the other? But I'd venture that in terms of, you know, human experience, you might find Gandhi one hell of a lot more influential than Donald Trump. You know. No, it's like that. But how I can measure it, it's an experiential feeling, isn't it?
More than Donald Trump?
Gandhi.
Gandhi.
Yeah.
Yes, I just didn't hear the name. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Or, you know, the world's great religious figures or whatever. Yeah. Yeah.
As it were,
Yeah.
of spiritual leader, teacher,
Yeah.
having an effect. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And the Dalai Lama.
Yeah, and maybe in your own experience you've got a teacher or group of people who come and study with at the Buddhist Society, you might find. I don't know. But it's by personal experience, isn't it? And then if it's bigger than your experience, then relying in that sense on somebody else in whom you feel you can rely or trust. Yeah. Or you could come at it from a very agnostic point of view. You could come at it and say, I don't know whether it's working or not, but it's better than not trying. There's all sorts of approaches.
Yes, and you could say that life on earth could be an awful lot worse if they weren't.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was just...
Yeah, no, I understand what you say. You know, when, so I sort of, well, you know, when my parents used to say, "Oh well, if it wasn't happening, it'd be an awful lot worse." I say, "Yeah, tell me about it." But it's so difficult. How are we doing? Any others? Oh, we're at 20:02, so maybe it's a good time to stop. Thank you very much for coming and putting up with me. And if you want some more, ask Odin.